Welcome to After the Download, the podcast that explores how people really use apps and other digital platforms, and what that means for the businesses that own and build them. Hosted by Redefining. On this podcast, we talk to product leaders, data scientists, editors, and journalists to uncover emerging trends, discuss best practices, and dive deep into the data behind everyday digital behavior that you need to win in today's competitive digital marketplace. Most business leaders are racing to adopt AI, but the real challenge is rebuilding trust to compete in an agentic future. In this episode of After the Download, Redefining CEO Chris Havemann sits down with Ian Brown, digital strategist, MIT-trained AI expert, and former CEO of RentalCars.com. Over the next 35 or so minutes, Ian draws on decades of experience to break down why traditional brands risk being left behind as AI takes on a bigger role in consumer decision-making, and why businesses need to rethink the path for both human customers and AI agents. They also tackle a question that's becoming harder and harder to ignore: how to rebuild trust and accountability in an AI-powered world. If you're a CEO or innovator navigating digital transformation, Ian's first-hand experience may change the way you think about building a sustainable, competitive advantage. And now, Chris Havemann and Ian Brown.
Well, welcome everyone back to the After the Download podcast. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by Ian Brown. Ian is someone I've been working with for a while. He's working as a consultant, but formerly a senior business leader in a number of digital businesses, and prior to that, a senior consultant at Oliver Wyman. Ian, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. So just to kick off, I think it'd be great for the listeners just to understand a bit more about you and your journey, quickly over your career in the kind of digital and brand space.
I guess I'm an engineer by training. If I go right back to my degree, actually worked for London Underground on and off for 5 years as an actual engineer. But I then joined a consulting firm, Oliver Wyman, or the firm that's now Oliver Wyman, as you mentioned. I thought I'd do that for 2 or 3 years and go get a proper job, like a lot of people. And 15 years later, I was still there. So I used to joke that I was people could make their own decision. Either I had a singular lack of career imagination, or I was quite enjoying it. And I then had the opportunity to go straight from consulting to be a CEO, which is a pretty rare and special opportunity. That was initially into a business called RentalCars.com, which had just become the world's largest online car hire platform at the time, and was a sister company of Booking.com, Kayak, Priceline, Agoda. So it was part of the Priceline Group's stable of brands, now Booking Holdings. I left end of 2019, just before COVID. The idea was, having been working really hard for a long time, finally take a sabbatical year before our boys got to senior school. And I often joke I had 2 crystal balls. There was a crystal ball that said, when's a good time to get out of the travel industry and cash in your shares? That one worked really well. The crystal ball said, when's a good time to take a year out and go traveling? That one was black. So I went back to work fairly quickly, did a bit of work. I stayed in tech, but more back-end tech. Spent the best part of 2 years running a, what would I call it, sort of data center, cybersecurity business. And then found myself back in consumer tech the last 2-3 years with a business called Flutter. So better known as Paddy Power, Betfair, Sky Bet, Sky Vegas, Tombola, PokerStars. I had the pleasure of being the chief exec of the UK and Ireland part of that business. And now I seem to have gone back to consulting. So doing some really interesting stuff this year as I kind of go back to work, a lot of which is sort of in and around the AI space and how consumers are interacting with AI.
Fascinating. Well, I think it would be a great time to be consulting and thinking about the kind of changing of the world with AI, which I guess we're going to come on and talk about quite a bit in this conversation. So over your career, then you've seen quite a lot of transformation. It feels like transformation might be a kind of recurring theme. Maybe that's true of a lot of business leaders, but if we think about the kind of the leap to digital that everyone made at the turn of the century, to the internet and the transformations of businesses then, and the transformations in progress now, what are your kind of observations about the journeys that business had to make in the internet age, and how that compares or contrasts with where we are now?
Up until AI, which I'll come back to, for me, the internet has been by far the biggest transformational enabler and kind of requirer to date. I remember those days, my early days in consulting, and one of the key questions for any business was, is your strategy pre-internet or post-internet? Your tech stack, is it pre-internet or post-internet? And a lot of businesses, it was a massive period of creative destruction happened because of the internet and what it allowed, right? And I've sort of said quite a few times that that's up until AI in our lifetimes has been the biggest shift, right? There've been sort of smaller important shifts around mobile and cloud, right? As you think about strategies and tech stacks, but the internet's been by far the biggest. As I think about this now, what did the internet change? It changed distribution, right? It changed the distribution of whatever information, of products, services, the way people could organize their supply chains. You went to Google for information, or as kind of a key marketing platform. You went to Amazon for almost any physical stuff, Netflix for entertainment, etc., right? But largely it's distribution of the same stuff, albeit in a different way and at different scales. And AI is tremendously exciting, a little bit scary in some ways, but it's not just distribution anymore. Is it the first thing that's impacting the cognition and judgment layer, right? And so you kind of move from humans doing tasks enabled by tools to humans supervising the agents that are doing tools, right? This already is and is going to be, I think, a very jagged frontier, much as we saw in those early days of the internet. Forgive me. Look at the businesses that I joined and the pleasure of being chief exec of. None of those really existed or could exist in the same way pre-internet versus post-internet. I think the same is going to happen here, right, with AI. And I see a lot of people asking questions around how AI can, take cost out, make them more efficient. For me, one of the key questions is how can AI help people fundamentally rethink businesses? So this is huge. Simple answer to your question. This is huge. It's exciting and slightly scary.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's interesting, isn't it? Because there are certain topics like, LLMs. I think all of us are getting to a greater or lesser extent our heads around how you use LLMs. But one of the things that I'm trying to get my head around is agentic, agents, and what an agentic future looks like. And I guess you can imagine it from the kind of consumer perspective, but from a business leader perspective, what are you seeing and thinking about in terms of how businesses prepare for an agentic future? And I guess we could see quite big differences between different businesses and different verticals, perhaps. But how do you see the agentic future, and what are business leaders got to do to cope and thrive in that world?
Well, at some level, what do any of us know yet? This is emerging, right? And as soon as we're done talking about agentic, we'll be talking about robots. But let's do agentic first. I think a lot of the focus so far has rightly and inevitably been on what I call efficiency AI, right? And efficiency agentic. How can you get the same work done with less people, less costs, more efficiently? But not everyone. Some businesses are looking to do more faster with the same people. Some businesses, are very few, but some are saying, how do we do a lot more work with quite a few more people? Which interestingly, the Frontier AI Labs tend to be in that space. Right? Whereas a lot of other people are sort of saying, "Hey, how do we use this to sort of take a lot of cost out?" But that's a really good set of sort of first order questions, if you like. But the more thoughtful leaders that I kind of come across and listen to are asking these sort of second order questions of how is the basis of competition going to shift? Right? How do I position myself in the business to both defend but also go on the offensive? And under that, you sort of get to some pretty important, challenging existential questions around, well, heck, if everybody in my industry that I've been competing against can essentially rent the same, frontier AI model capacity that I can, right? What's the basis of competition now? And where does that take you? Right, what is my real cost base? What is my real capability base? My headcount in 3 to 5 years? What is my strategic moat? How do I get there? And if you're in the public markets, geez, what do I say about that right now? When the questions just kind of keep on coming, and I haven't figured out all the answers yet. So it's it's those early stages. It's I think part of the trick is, are you asking the right question? And I suppose my encouragement with my sort of consulting hat back on these days is, don't just ask those first order questions around opportunity, efficiency, and taking cost out. Yeah, that's important. That's the first step. I'd probably advocate people really need to be thinking hard about the basis of competition, right? The moat over the next sort of 3 to 5 years for the business, and how does AI and agentic change the answer, change the nature of winning, and really shape where you should be thinking about placing your chips as a leader.
It's interesting, Ian, because hearing you talk, I've been reading lots of pieces, like I'm sure you have, the classic things on LinkedIn about, the death of the strategy consultants, and, because now you can just ask your LLMs. But actually hearing you talk, I'm almost starting to think quite the opposite. If we're asking ourselves questions about how we, retain and build competitive advantage in a completely new sort of frontier world, arguably we need our strategy consultants more than ever. What's your perspective on that?
I'm smiling listening to you, Chris. If creative destruction is going to happen across a wide range of industries, I think not every industry, consulting is already and will be in the vanguard of that. It's worth remembering them. There's a lot of, consulting's a broad church, right? Everything from the big, SIs like the sort of Accentures of this world, through the strategy houses, McKinsey, Bain, etc., operational shops, specialists. There's a lot out. But the baseline here is the nature of work. Exactly to your point, the nature of work required by clients changes fast, and it's just changed very fast. Old consulting, lots of people doing analysis, that dies off pretty quickly, I'd say, in the smart private sector. I think the public sector tends to operate to a different beat. But if a lot of that stuff's getting killed off on, one side of the creative destruction barrier, the other side is, the opportunity to scramble to get ahead of clients, and have at least part of the answer on AI and agentic that we're talking about. And then the smart ones, and I don't profess to know who is thinking about this hard enough in the consulting world right now. I'm not close enough to it, although I talk to people in consulting most weeks. But if part of it is like, how do I get ahead of clients so I can, as a consultant, help them navigate the AI and agentic world, right? The other part surely needs to be, am I thinking hard enough about my own consulting business and my own, operating and delivery model, right? And am I running hard enough to first leverage AI through my business, the efficiency opportunity, right? But am I also thinking hard about how do I just fundamentally rethink the consulting business? The speculation, and as you sort of listen to a lot of the AI stuff around, how many months are we away from the first $1 billion business that's literally a one-person business and the rest is a series of agents? And I think that will happen, right? There'll be many, but I think that will happen. The same is true in consulting, right? One person, in this case me, say my own experience, I got so much done in the last few months using frontier AI models, and my model of choice has changed in that period. But I've got so much done, I just don't need a team anymore, right? And a smart person could turn up with a lot of experience and hopefully a bit of good judgment, and can achieve a huge amount. So, to your question, I think yes, creative destruction in consulting needs to reinvent itself in terms of what it's delivering. And there's massive opportunities to help businesses get ahead on AI right now. But also, the nature of consulting is just going to change. And the right question you should be asking as a leader of a consulting firm is, how do I build that new model? It's almost like the Nestle Nespresso moment. I kind of need a new model, and go back to Clayton Christensen and Innovator's Dilemma. The right way to build a new model is not iteratively in your own business. It's take a small number of people in another building, set them the challenge of the future, and let them run at it. And I don't know who's doing that, but if I were running a meaningful sized consulting firm today, that's what I'd be thinking about doing.
That makes complete sense. And I love your framing of AI, and it seems like probably more companies are going to have to be quite radical about rethinking, companies and businesses, how they adapt to the new future. If we sort of turn the attention to the consumer side of things, obviously, you've been the CEO of businesses with millions of customers. Consumer behavior is a topic close to your heart. It's also a topic close to our hearts at Reality Miners. As you know, our technology captures behavior of consumers on their devices. As you think about AI, and obviously we're all living our own personal experience, but what are you seeing in terms of changing consumer behavior driven by AI? What intrigues you, and what do you think we should be looking out for?
Yeah, well, as you know almost better than anyone, Chris, I mean, it's already here. I'll even though I'm not a McKinsey guy, I kind of quote some McKinsey data that just really stood out to me at the end of last year. So this comes from a study McKinsey released, I think it was December, so it's already 6 months old and therefore completely out of date. But even in, presumably they did the survey in October, November or something like that. Even then, for European consumers, they had, I think it was 84% of European consumers said they use AI tools daily. Not just once every, but daily. And there were then a bunch of answers, somewhere between like the 45 and 65% mark of, what percentage of consumers use them to comparing brands, prices, reviews, learning about a category, etc. So that discovery shift to models is already playing out, right? It's already significantly playing out. You're not just sort of going to sort of SEO driven sites for it. So that, this already has major implications before we go any further on marketing, discovery sites. I think if you're in the meta search space in travel, i.e. you don't control the booking, but you previously just surfaced a bunch of brands and products, that's probably a very difficult place to be, right? But we're still day one, right? So this shift is going to continue, probably accelerate. I struggle to think now when I want to figure anything out. I only go to Google and type something in if I know the thing I want exists and I want to drop directly to that page. Otherwise, I'm personally in AI models all the time. So this will just continue, and the discovery is then going to move from either human interacting with the LLM to learn and get recommendations to my agent's going to do it, or my agents. I'll probably have different agents for, I suspect, different functions, different categories. But an agent is going to go and either decide on my behalf, or at least narrow down the option set very rapidly on my behalf.
Yeah.
If you're on the other side of this as a business, the consumer you've just sort of spent decades learning to market to, A, has just gone somewhere else. B, is increasingly no longer the decision maker, right? Yeah. So marketing to consumers dies as we know it. Increasingly, you're marketing to models and marketing to agents, and that's now a $100 billion or multi-hundreds of $1 billion discipline, right? And to your point, and this is where I kind of get excited on your behalf at Reality Mine, right? There's a fundamental measurement problem here, right? Because as behavior changes, right, and discovery is getting done in models, and then decisions are kind of getting made in models and agents, right? Well, all the old data models fall away. How much can you trust the attribution in your ad platforms of choice? Well, that's starting to break. How much can you trust if you're an online business, right? How much can you trust the data exhaust, right? So Silicon Valley term, but the data that you've relied on historically, clicks, sessions, search terms, that stuff thins out or just disappears into black boxes. So understanding real consumer behavior all the way from initial intent, whatever that may be, I'd say, I think we might go on holiday, in June, right? All the way through to decision and then purchase, right? Well, where do you go? And how do you distinguish that really valuable, now increasingly scarce human signal and human intents to decision chain from all the noise out there? I get really excited for you guys at Reality Mine, because that's the data you're sitting on, right? And that's part of the that's a bit of gold here, right?
What you've just described is sort of scarily disruptive. If you think about even what a brand means, changes, right? In an agentic future, brands as a shortcut for lack of information, trust, and so on. break down when many attributes of the product being searched for, let's say by an agent, are chosen by the agent, not by some emotional connection to a historic brand. Although I'm sure that's still going to exist. There are certain categories you can imagine brands will matter much more than others, which is really fascinating. But I think you're right. I mean, I think the early understanding of how consumer behavior is changing and agentic behavior is changing is going to presumably help companies navigate this space. Get a sense of the early adopters and the innovators, and you might get a clue on where your market's going. Right? That's what we believe at Reality Mind. And this is a crystal ball question, Ian, but we spend a lot of time thinking about apps. We're all glued to our smartphones. We've all got our favorite apps. We spend a lot of time with a relatively small number of apps, in fact. Do you think that's quite stable in this AI agentic future? Or do you think, in other words, the smartphone's going to be with us for many years to come as a kind of key tool? Or are you one of those who believes we're all going to be wearing, different hardware elements talking to LLMs, and that future's very close?
Well, I've already been pretty clear, Chris, that some of my crystal balls are good and some of my crystal balls are pretty terrible. So some level, what do I know, right? And I'm sort of sat here like with a PC, an iPad, wearing an Apple Watch, and a Whoop. So are any of those going to be the device or the evolution of the device, or is the thing that Johnny Ive is allegedly building with OpenAI going to be the thing? Who knows? I'm not going to try and do long-term hardware prognostication. But the app question, that's a closer in one. I mean, look, we've all been trained now over the last 15 or 20 years, right? Since iPhone, and then the sort of other imitators sort of came along. We've been trained for 15 or 20 years to use apps, right? So we're all habit formed, and habits take time to change. So I think, will things change? Yes, they will. In my opinion, not overnight. I think there'll be some things that sets of apps that don't vanish, right? Even in the sort of medium to long term, like stuff that's regulated or high trust, experience rich, gaming, social, banking, etc. I think anything where this sort of fundamental experience is social, that stuff stays relevant because the app is the experience, the app is the product, right? I think where it gets more challenging is if you have a sort of a thinner retail or utility or aggregator app sort of somewhere in the middle, that's kind of then a sort of a risk of getting hollowed out, right? And so the what's the main thing about an app? Well, it's about the kind of like, click into it, click. It's a really sort of simple, easy UI. That's in many ways been its main asset, right? As a sort of great shortcut for something I want to get done as a user. But if that then becomes an agent API call, those thin in the middle apps risk very quickly kind of no longer being relevant. And that's a model break. So what to do, how to adapt. I suppose I sort of think about three things, and this bridges a little bit back to your last question, right? So firstly, split the funnel, right? There's going to be humans interacting with you in your sort of app surface, and I'll use app more generically now. It could be the app, it could be your sort of like your mobile website, but split the funnel. Start thinking really clearly. And I'm actually having this conversation with a very big e-commerce business at the moment, right? But think really clearly about what's the human path and what's going to be the human path of the future, versus how do I become the default app, or certainly default API, default surface that agents reach for, right? And there's two places you'd love to be in an agentic world, right? As a platform. You'd love to be the place that all the agents come to in your category. You like to win it. You're the default source, right? Even better, if you can, you'd want to be the agent platform for that category, where you have built the agents or the agent suite that sort of consumers ultimately sort of default to, and it's going to be like the internet all over again. It's going to be a little bit winner takes all. Those sorts of things. But sort of start thinking really, really clearly and really fast about what's the consumer path and how does that change, and what's the agent path. And then in the same way that, certainly over many years, I and my teams have worked really hard to optimize, to make things ever better, faster, clearer, low friction for humans, what's the equivalent for the agent? Yeah, you got to optimize for agents now, right? And that's different. That's about, have you got really good, rich proprietary data that's really well structured and easy for agents to consume, right? Is it low latency, right? Have you got your NCP or sort of set up well so the agent can navigate to where it wants to go? Ideally, have you got differentiated supply? Ideally, own the transaction. I think if you're in the middle and you don't own the transaction, you're not the merchant of record. I think it's a really difficult place to be. So ideally, own the transaction, and own and do not ever give up the difficult to do stuff, right? Refunds, disruptions, something's gone wrong. Because those are the moments when humans want to deal with humans typically, right? So if you just let that go into the agentic world, you're giving up a moat for the future. So back to your question, what would I be thinking about doing? I'll be thinking about splitting the funnel as a human path, as an agent path. And I also just come back to think really clearly about what's the data you rely on. Because a lot of the old data, is no longer going to get trusted. And also if you haven't split the path and you've still got one path for your kind of UI, and now you've got humans and agents all interacting in the same place, your metrics is just going to go haywire. And it'd be very difficult to see which way's up. So, get really clear about agent path, human path, but also what's the right set of metrics? What are your sanity metrics for each of those two paths?
Free consulting, folks, on the After the Download podcast. This is great.
This is the fun stuff, though. It's the stuff you have to think about, right?
Yeah, no, these are really fundamental thoughts. Just listening to you talking, you mentioned the word trust a couple of times there. And I want to sort of come back to this theme of trust. Do you have any thoughts on just trust in this AI future?
I think you framed it well in your question, Chris. There's a business side to this, and there's a consumer side to this, right? If I sort of put my business leader hat on first, trust for me in business is going to be much more about is this going to be reliable? As I sort of put agents to work. Or indeed I choose partners to work with who are delivering stuff to me with AI and agentically, right? Is this going to be reliable? Where is the accountability and where's the risk? On the consumer side, it's really about alignment and control and representation. So I think, me as a consumer, I'll hand decisions to an agent where I think, it feels like my agent, right? And I can trust it to represent me in the world within the parameters I've given it. So I also then need to trust that those parameters can be sort of set and sort of complied with, and it will kind of get on and do things. But I'll also be more willing to trust it in categories where, certainly initially, it's kind of a defined problem. It's not emotional for me. It's not necessarily representing how I turn up in the world. Yeah, I would trust it right now with, I used to get one of 2 or 3 different trains to Manchester most mornings, right? In my booking.com days. Gave the agent look at my diary and sort of figure out which train do I need a ticket for. Carry on, right? As long as I'm sort of confident you're not going to sort of spend up to my limit on my credit card and buy me 100 tickets, that's fine. Am I right now going to start sort of trusting agents with, I don't know, decision choices, education choices for my kids, or financial planning overall, or health? No, I'm not. Right? So I think it really does come back to sort of trust and representation, and also kind of model capabilities. But if I trust an agent is, the go-to agent for its category, it's built by kind of good people who at some level I can trust, and it'll do what I want it to do. And if it's unclear, it will ask me around setting those parameters. Then I'll absolutely be willing to trust it. But I also, thinking out loud, I'll throw one contrarian point back at myself, which is trust can matter less than we sometimes assume. Right, so particularly where you've got those, lower engagement situations, people use stuff they don't trust all the time. Right, if it's convenient enough, they'll use it. Right? Look at social media. How many people trust different flavors of sort of social media, or kind of what they find in there? Not a huge amount, but are they using it? Yes, but that's not an emotional, personal, high stakes purchase, right? In the same way that me buying healthcare might be.
There's also judgment calls by the consumer, right? It's like it's hard to discern right now how successful, the black box is doing something. But over time, we'll learn. We'll, as humans, I think, we'll form better judgments on that. And maybe there's a whole area of kind of the branding of agents. The whole reasons that you feel good about an agent. Part of that can be an emotional trust element, not just a functional element, which I think is where a lot of our attention, quite rightly, is today. Does it work? Does it functionally work?
That's a great point. I fully agree.
Let's move on to my very last question, Ian. This has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And this is very generic, but if you sort of step back, and I think you've partly answered this, but if you think about business leaders, CEOs and so on, looking at the next 3 to 5 years and the challenges that they face, what do you see as the key challenges for a CEO today of, let's say, a consumer business? How would you frame that?
Talent's always been a challenge in business leadership, but now there's a whole new paradox of, well, I probably need, not necessarily, but I probably need fewer people on the old jobs to be done. And a set of new people or newly skilled people on the new jobs to be done. Well, how do I do that? And how do I do that fast? Right? People that really get AI and agentic, right? I think there's a timing challenge. So much is shifting so fast. I just think back to the model capability when I was at MIT in October versus the frontier model capability now, and it kind of night and day. Whereas, often, CEOs, big senior leaders, you're making capital allocation decisions that are going to last meaningful time periods. So how are you're shooting at multiple moving targets in a way, right? Things keep changing, right? And some of that change is discontinuous, right? The tech will keep evolving pretty quickly, but with some discontinuities. Regulation tends to kind of go from 0 to 1 in some areas. So all this stuff is sort of shifting, and that those risks aren't symmetric. And some boards are comfortable with that because it's the kind of world they've been in, right? A lot of boards are less comfortable with that and want more certain ROI cases with months and ideally years worth of defensible data to sort of stand up a big business case on. And some of that stuff just isn't going to be possible. Or if you want it, great, but by the time you've got it, it's going to be too late. So there's a timing challenge. And then I go back to what's the nature of your business and your, on one hand, your defensive moat. On the other hand, what in my old consulting days we call sort of your sources of strategic control. What's the thing that protects your right to make money and enhances it and stretches your competitive advantage? And a lot of that stuff, I would argue, is going away, right? Quietly but surely, right? That scale doesn't apply in the way it used to, right? Maybe data scale does, but scale of business doesn't apply in the way it used to. Back to what we said about consulting, brand, I don't think will work in the same way. I think it still has a really important trust elements, to your point, Chris. So a lot of that stuff quietly gets weaker. So where is your advantage, right? And how are you rethinking your business? I will unashamedly always come back to the human side of things. Right? It's our job as business leaders to lead and inspire people through change. And that's always been true. It keeps getting faster, but there's now a new element of that change, which is a lot of people fearing their own irrelevance in a world of agency, right? So the job we have to do as leaders becomes frankly, ever better, right? But when people are anxious about that, then they're no longer going to be relevant. They might not have a job. Well, there's a risk that starts killing candor and honesty. So what do you do? And I suppose I come back to, in the spirit of coming back to being human, the key here for me is at one level, how open are you, your business, your people to learning, right? And as a leader, are you making the time and space and sending the right signals about that learning? Not just learning, but learning velocity. And as a leader, kind of the job is no longer to be exactly right. It's getting the culture right, getting the people right, and being able to execute at a pace where I'd almost sort of say you're the fastest to stop being out of date rather than you necessarily know the answer. Right? And a super strength becomes, or an ideal super strength becomes, you're in the businesses and the people's ability to learn and to change. And I think there's a Goldilocks zone to be had there of of a super strength of, learning and change and velocity is our strength as a business. And if you could somehow distill that, bottle that, lead people through it, I think that's for me going to be one of the most important skill sets as a leader, whatever this crazy, fun, exciting, slightly scary future brings.
Yeah, that's a fantastic way to end this session, this discussion today, which I've hugely enjoyed. Really interesting your thoughts there about what leadership looks like as we go through this incredibly disruptive period. So, Ian, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for your time today and for being a guest on the podcast.
Oh, pleasure. Great to be here. I enjoyed it. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of After the Download. If you found today's insights valuable, subscribe to stay ahead of the curve at the intersection of technology, data, and consumer behavior. Please take a moment to share, rate, and review, helping us grow this exciting new thought leadership channel. And keep joining us as we connect you to world-class product and brand strategists, data experts, and key observers of the digital space. We also welcome your feedback. Feel free to send us your ideas and observations at atdownload@realitymind.com. That's @download@realitymind.com. Thanks, and see you next time.